the moon cast its pale glow over the decrepit cemetery, Sarah, Jake and I gathered at the rusty iron gates, our hearts pounding with a mix of fear and excitement. The locals had warned us repeatedly about the cursed grounds, but our curiosity had gotten the better of us. We stood there, staring into the dense fog that seemed to swallow the ancient graves whole, unaware of the malevolent force lurking beneath. We hesitated for a moment, the old rusted gate creaking as we pushed it open. The sound sent a shiver down my spine, but I shrugged it off and followed Sarah and Jake inside. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. Overgrown weeds and tangled vines snaked their way across the ground, and the tombstones leaned at odd angles as if trying to escape their eerie surroundings. As we ventured deeper, the fog grew denser, and the moonlight struggled to penetrate the thick canopy of twisted branches above us. Every step we took was accompanied by the crunching of dead leaves and the occasional snap of a twig. We walked in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that we were being watched. We came across a row of crumbling mausoleums, their stone facades covered in moss and ivy. The doors were either hanging off their hinges or missing entirely, revealing dark, empty chambers within. It was here that Sarah suggested we split up to cover more ground. Reluctantly, we agreed, each of us taking a different path through the cemetery. I wandered aimlessly, my flashlight casting long shadows on the gravestones. The eerie silence was occasionally broken by the hoot of an owl or the rustling of leaves in the wind. As I rounded a corner, I stumbled upon an old, weathered tombstone partially hidden by a thick layer of moss. The inscription was barely legible, but I could make out the name Eleanor. A strange sense of dread washed over me as I knelt to clear the moss away. As my fingers brushed against the cold stone, a sudden chill ran through my body. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I stood up quickly, feeling an overwhelming urge to find Sarah and Jake. As I retraced my steps, the fog seemed to grow thicker, obscuring my view. I called out for Sarah and Jake, my voice echoing through the deserted graveyard. Panic started to set in as there was no response. I quickened my pace, my flashlight flickering ominously, as if it too was afraid of what lay ahead. Finally, I saw a faint light in the distance and hurried towards it. It was Sarah, standing in front of an open grave, her face pale and eyes wide with terror. She pointed wordlessly into the pit, and I hesitated before shining my flashlight down. What I saw made my blood run cold. At the bottom of the grave lay a wooden box, its lid partially open. Inside, there was a collection of strange old artifacts, candles, a small mirror, and a bundle of dried herbs. But what caught my attention was a small weathered diary resting on top. I picked it up, my hands trembling, and opened it to the first page. The diary belonged to Eleanor, the name on the tombstone I had found earlier. Her writing was hurried, desperate, detailing her fear of a dark force that had plagued her family for generations. As I read, a sense of foreboding grew within me. It felt as if her words were a warning, a plea for help that had gone unanswered for centuries. Sarah and I exchanged uneasy glances, the gravity of our discovery sinking in. We knew we had to find Jake and get out of there. The fog seemed even thicker now, the air heavier, as if the cemetery itself was alive and aware of our presence. We moved quickly, calling out Jake's name, hoping he hadn't ventured too far. After what felt like an eternity, we found him near an old chapel at the edge of the cemetery. He was staring at something on the ground, his face ashen. We rushed over and saw what had captured his attention. A series of strange symbols etched into the dirt, forming a circle around a small stone altar. The symbols looked ancient, unlike anything we had ever seen. Jake explained that he had seen similar markings in the diary, warnings of rituals meant to bind or summon dark forces. We realized with growing horror that we had stumbled upon something far more sinister than we could have imagined. With no time to lose, we decided to leave immediately. But as we turned to go, the ground beneath us trembled, and a low guttural growl echoed through the cemetery. Panic surged through us as we sprinted towards the gates, the sound of footsteps and whispers closing in around us. We burst through the gate, gasping for breath, and collapsed on the other side. The cemetery seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, as if angered by our intrusion. We knew we had to leave, but the weight of what we had discovered kept us rooted to the spot for a moment longer. As we glanced back at the desolate graveyard, we saw shadows moving among the tombstones, too swift and too dark to be human. The fog seemed to writhe and twist, forming shapes that defied explanation. We had unearthed something that was never meant to be found, and now it was free. The journey home was a blur, our minds racing with fear and confusion. We barely spoke, each of us lost in our own thoughts, haunted by the images of what we had seen. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had made a terrible mistake, one that would have consequences far beyond that night. In the days that followed, strange things began to happen. Sarah started having nightmares, vivid and horrifying, of the cemetery and the things we had seen there. Jake reported seeing shadows out of the corner of his eye, always just beyond his reach. As for me, I felt a constant sense of being watched, a heavy, oppressive presence that never left my side. We tried to put the experience behind us, but it seemed the cemetery had followed us home. Objects in our houses moved on their own, strange noises echoed through the halls, and an unshakable feeling of dread hung over us. We knew we had to do something, but we didn't know what. Desperation drove us back to the diary. We pored over Eleanor's words, looking for any clue on how to undo what we had done. Her final entries were frantic, describing rituals and incantations meant to banish the darkness. But the language was old, and the instructions cryptic, leaving us more confused than ever. One night, Sarah had a particularly vivid nightmare. She saw Eleanor standing at the edge of the grave, her eyes filled with sorrow and fear. She whispered a single word, "Return." Sarah woke up screaming, convinced that Eleanor was trying to tell us something. We took it as a sign that we needed to go back. As terrifying as the thought was, we knew it was our only hope of ending the nightmare. Armed with the diary and a few supplies, we made our way back to the cemetery, each step filled with dread. The cemetery was even more foreboding than before. The fog was thicker, the air colder, and the sense of being watched more intense. We retraced our steps to the open grave, the diary clutched tightly in Sarah's hands. We knew we had to perform the ritual, but none of us were sure what would happen. We set up the items as described in the diary, our hands shaking with fear. The candles flickered in the wind, casting eerie shadows across the ground. Sarah read the incantation aloud, her voice trembling. As she spoke, the air grew heavy and still, the fog closing in around us. For a moment, nothing happened. We stood there, holding our breath, waiting for some sign that we had succeeded. But then a low growl echoed through the cemetery, followed by a series of loud thudding footsteps. The ground shook beneath us, and we knew the malevolent force was coming. We huddled together, terrified and unsure of what to do next. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until we could feel the vibrations beneath our feet. The air crackled with energy, and the fog seemed to come alive, swirling around us in a frenzy. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped, and the fog parted to reveal a shadowy figure standing before us. It was tall, its features obscured by darkness, but its presence was overwhelming. We could feel its anger, its hunger, and we knew we were in grave danger. Sarah, with a courage I didn't know she possessed, stepped forward and held out the diary. She spoke to the figure, begging it to take back the curse and leave us in peace. The figure didn't move, but its eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness, seemed to lock onto the diary. A tense silence followed, broken only by the sound of our ragged breathing. Then slowly, the figure reached out and took the diary from Sarah's trembling hands. It opened the book, its movements slow and deliberate, and began to read. We watched in stunned silence as the figure read the diary, its expression unreadable. The air around us seemed to lighten, the oppressive weight lifting slightly. When it finished, it closed the book and looked at us, its eyes now filled with something that resembled sorrow. The figure spoke, its voice a low, haunting whisper that echoed in our minds. It thanked us for bringing the diary back and explained that Eleanor had been trying to warn others of the curse for centuries. By disturbing her grave, we had unleashed the very force she had tried to contain. It told us that the curse could not be undone, but it could be controlled. The diary held the key to binding the darkness once more, but it required a sacrifice. We stood there, stunned and terrified, as the figure explained what needed to be done. We had to return the diary to Eleanor's grave and perform one final ritual. But this time, one of us would have to stay behind, to serve as a guardian and ensure the curse remained bound. The realization hit us like a ton of bricks. We had to choose who would stay. The tension among us was palpable as we debated our options. None of us wanted to stay, but we knew it was the only way to protect ourselves and others. In the end, it was Jake who volunteered, his face pale but resolute. He felt it was his responsibility, having been the one to suggest the exploration in the first place. With heavy hearts, we agreed to the plan. We gathered the necessary items and made our way back to Eleanor's grave. The figure followed us, its presence a constant reminder of the gravity of our situation. We knew this was our last chance to make things right. We performed the ritual as instructed, our hands shaking with fear and sorrow. Jake stood by the grave, ready to take on his new role as guardian. As we finished, the ground beneath us trembled and the air crackled with energy once more. The figure nodded in approval, its eyes filled with a mix of sadness and gratitude. it vanished into the fog, leaving us alone with Jake. We embraced him one last time, tears streaming down our faces, before reluctantly making our way back to the gate. As we stepped outside, the fog began to lift, and the oppressive weight that had hung over us for so long seemed to dissipate. We knew we had done the right thing, but the pain of leaving Jake behind was almost too much to bear. In the days and weeks that followed, the strange occurrences ceased. The nightmares stopped, the shadows vanished, and the sense of being watched faded away. But the memory of that night, and the sacrifice Jake made, would haunt us forever. Sarah and I visited the cemetery often, leaving flowers at Eleanor's grave and speaking to Jake, hoping he could hear us. We knew the curse was bound once more, but the cost had been high. As we looked back at the desolate graveyard, we vowed to never forget the events that had changed our lives forever, and the friend we had lost to the darkness.